I'm Ed Adams, and this is the weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. If genealogy were a board game, it would most likely be described as easy to learn but hard to master. Since the advent of online genealogy, it's gotten easier and easier to learn about your family's history. But that ease of use is a double-edged sword. So it's easy to find things sometimes that you don't really understand what you're looking at. You don't always have to understand what sources are available, how they're generated and kept, what their purpose was. You can just search a name, date, and general location, and you can start finding things right away. I think this is the number one reason that genealogy has become more popular over the years. No one wants to get started in a hobby that appears to be impenetrable from the start, but like many things, genealogy is subject to the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's the roller coaster curve depicting confidence as graphed over experience. When hopping on Ancestry.com, I was initially a little overwhelmed at everything that seemed to be available, but I quickly summited the peak of Mount Stupid, and honestly, I sat there for a good long time. It wasn't until I started to explain some of my findings to my family and had to start contending with their questions that I started to realize that maybe I didn't know quite as much as I thought I did. Each source type that you'll work with is like an onion, with layers of knowledge that can be gained through a better understanding of what that source is, why it was produced, and how it was produced. Don't worry about trying to become an expert on all the source types. Virtually no one is. There's a few basic sources that you should probably know a little more about if you're going to take genealogy seriously. From there, you can dig into whatever source types you find most interesting or most useful. Really good genealogists are often rock solid with the basics, and then dive deep into a specialty or two. No one's an expert at everything. One of the basics, though, that would help you considerably as you get started is probate. We'll all deal with it, but unless we understand the process, we might not be understanding everything that it's telling us. If you've never had to deal directly with the probate process in your own life, think about the complexity of an end-user agreement for the software that you use. It's dense, seemingly written in a foreign language, and all you're really interested in doing is using the software, so you just click accept and go about your business. But that's how Adobe ends up owning rights to all of your work in Photoshop, and that's how important details can escape you when dealing with your ancestors' probate. It's a complex legal process, and its documents use a specialized vocabulary that may mean more than you understand. It's a process, and not just a document. So let's look at it and get a better understanding of Probate 101. To get started, let's look at some terms that you're going to need to understand. The first term is testator. This was the person who is now deceased and had written the last will, or at least dictated the will. In cases where there is no will, they were said to have died intestate. Legatees are people who stand to inherit property as devised in the will, and a surety is a sort of like cosigner today. They agree to be held liable for another person's debts or obligations associated with the probate process. The term probate itself is a term that I'd never encountered before working on genealogy. The term refers to the process by which someone's possessions, both real and personal, is divided up amongst his or her heirs. For much of American history, the probate process has only been followed when the individual who passed owned real property or perhaps had an unusually valuable amount of personal property, or if there were minor children who were left without a guardian as a result of the individual's passing. This usually applied to men, but I have found many cases of women having their estates probated. But this was usually in cases where the widows had been married to men who had owned significant real property, much of which they had left to their widow. So if your ancestor didn't own land and died without children, or after their children were grown, there may not be a probate file to find. Don't despair, though, because just because there may not be a probate file on them doesn't mean that there isn't anything to learn about them in probate records. They may have inherited property from other relatives, and sometimes you can find them as witnesses on other people's wills, or perhaps they inventoried another individual's estate. I've seen a case where the ancestor I was interested in was referenced in an unrelated person's will simply because they were delineating which bit of property they were leaving to a particular son. The land was specified by saying, "The land originally granted to so-and-so." Sure, that's not as great as finding a full probate file on your target individual, but it's certainly better than nothing, and it can help you with mapping out historic properties, which I really enjoy doing. Once you've determined that your ancestor's property was probated, it's helpful to understand the process itself. Once your ancestor has passed away, someone, usually the executor, named in the will, would file a petition for the probate process to begin. In the case that your ancestor had no will, usually a family member or a business associate would file the petition. That brings me to a pausing point, though, because I want to make sure that you understand that just because your ancestor may not have had a will doesn't mean that their estate didn't go through the probate process. If they owned real property or had minor children left without a guardian, there was almost certainly a probate process. So oftentimes, looking at the will books isn't enough. Sometimes I've found that full probate packages have not been digitized, so it never hurts to visit or call probate office in the county that your ancestor lived in and see. I have more than once been eternally grateful to a clerk in the probate judge's office who happily went and dug through their files and then copied a few dozen files for me. Once they even mailed it to me for free, but I wouldn't expect that. If no one in the probate judge's office is willing to help you, and you can't visit, you can reach out to a local genealogical society, and they may have someone who would be willing to go and do that work for a small fee. But back to the probate process. Once the petition for probate was filed, in many cases, notifications would be published in local newspapers, so that's another good place to look for information about the death of your ancestor. This was required because before doling out any of the property to their heirs, the court had a responsibility to ensure that all the outstanding debts of your ancestor were satisfied. In most cases with your ancestor's will, the first statement after the obligatory sound mind and stuff is the statement that all their just debts be paid. That wasn't just your ancestor being honorable, that was required. So advertising the death in the paper for several weeks would give an opportunity for anyone who held one of those debts to come forward and make their claim against the estate. During this time of notification, the witnesses to the will would come forward and testify as to the legitimacy of the will. This would ensure that the court had the right will and that it had been produced when the deceased was still of sound mind. This was called proving the will. Sometimes on transcribed wills, you'll see a statement at the very bottom of your will stating that it was proved on a certain date. This is what that's referring to. So you can now know that your ancestor died at least sometime before that date. Most times it would be shortly before, but I have seen cases of wills being proved well after the deceased passed away. I have, however, never seen a case where there was a will proved before. In some locations, it is possible to do what is called living probate, but I've never seen it, and it's usually initiated by the person who owns the estate anyway, so I think it would be pretty obvious. Either way, if you ever see people claiming that your ancestor died on a date that was after their will was proved, that's a big red flag to investigate. The will is, of course, one of the most valuable pieces of the probate packet. It will have loads of fairly detailed information regarding names, relationships, and property. It will often be a fairly exhaustive list of family members, but it won't always be. In some cases, adult children may have already received their inheritance before the death of their parent, so the only children mentioned in the will might be younger children who still stood to inherit. Usually, if this is the case, that will be mentioned, but they may not mention their older children by name, but just say something like, "My remaining property is to be sold and the proceeds divided among all of my children, that is, to include my eldest son who already received his inheritance." Those cases are frustrating, but it does at least confirm that there are older children to investigate. While the will is your primary target when doing probate research, please don't stop there, if you can. Look for letters of administration, which were basically the court orders to the executor. You may find that the executor named in the will requested relief from the obligation for some reason or another, and a new executor was named. You may find executor bonds in which the executor pledges to pay a fee, usually pretty considerable, if they failed in their duties. This brings me to another pausing point. Who was the executor and what were their responsibilities? The executor was someone named in the will by the deceased who was to administer the estate throughout the probate process. This was the person who needed to locate and coordinate for the proving of the will, needed to settle all public and private debts, usually arranged for the disposition of remains, managed the distribution of property and arranged for the sale of the remaining property, and kept accounts of the whole operation. They were also on the hook to handle any litigation if there were issues with the claims on the estate. It was a big job and could often take a few years to fully complete. Because of this, you can often find updates on the accounting of the estate in the probate packet. Continuing on with the probate process and what you'll find in the packet, though, part of the process was documenting the inventory and value of the estate. Usually, several disinterested parties would be selected to go through and do this. I think inventories are oftentimes the most interesting things that you'll find in the probate packet. I once found an inventory that was so complete, they listed the title and author of every book in the possession of my ancestor. Now that's the kind of information that will give you a clue into who the individual was. It's a heck of a lot more enlightening than just knowing their birth, marriage, and death dates. Many times I've found it fascinating and a bit depressing to see how few possessions even relatively wealthy people in the 18th and 19th century had. After reading through one of those inventories and then turning around and looking at my own house, it makes me want to aggressively de-stuff. You can find receipts and bills of sale in the probate packet. The receipt would be a record of debts paid out and debts received, because keep in mind that while your ancestor likely died owing people money, they also likely died with others owing them. Money wasn't as readily available in much of the United States in the 18th and early 19th centuries, so debts oftentimes carried on for months or even years. This can be surprisingly informative. One of my female ancestors, who died in 1830, had her estate probated, and I found the receipts for it. There was a very long list of people who owed her estate massive sums of money, which struck me as odd. My suspicion is that when her husband died almost 30 years prior, the liquidation of his estate left her with a fair amount of money, and she may have been functioning as a kind of early bank, as that area wouldn't see one until much later. I may of course be wrong, but the amount of money that she was still owed at her death indicated that her level of activity in the local economy was well beyond what I'd assumed of a woman in the early to mid-19th century American South. Bills of sale are also interesting. This is where the auctioned or sold portion of the estate was recorded, so you can see each item in the inventory that wasn't specifically laid out to an heir in the will and who bought it and how much they paid. Want to find out who inherited your 6th great-grandfather's Revolutionary Cavalry saber? Probate record bills of sale are a great place to start. Once the debts were settled, both incoming and outgoing, and the non-allocated portion of the estate was sold off, the remaining property was distributed according to the will. In the case of people who died without a will, who were said to be intestate, the court would determine the distribution of all remaining property after the debts were settled. As a part of this process, you might find records of release where each of the heirs in the will testified that their portion of the will was executed and that they no longer had any claims against the estate. After all heirs recorded their release, the executor was finally done and the probate case was closed. Again, this would often be several years after the death of the estate holder. So, I hope you can see that there is a ton of information to be found in probate records, if you just go looking for them and don't just stop at the will. I've got full packets consisting of several dozen documents that have been really exciting to dig through and looking for these needles in the haystacks. I hope you found something useful in today's episode, so go out there and start looking in online probate records. And if you have any target ancestors who lived nearby, go hit up those courthouses and get to digging. If you find something interesting in some probate documents, I'd love to hear about it on Twitter, @TheWGTPod. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.